Every nation has a version of a State of the Nation address, whether it's called the SONA in South Africa, a Discours sur l'état de la nation in French-speaking African countries like Senegal, or simply a presidential address to parliament as in Nigeria. These speeches share a common purpose. They communicate the direction, priorities, and vision of the state to the nation. In this episode, we explore how to critically engage with these addresses, using South Africa's SONA as a case study to understand what policymakers are saying about governance, development, and the challenges that face the country.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the
This
Facts.
is Behind the Facts.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
Thanks for tuning in into Behind the Facts.
Today I'm joined by two of Africa Check's researchers who I would like to welcome to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about what they do at Africa Check.
Hi, Thipe, or I guess hi, everyone. I'm Keegan Leech. I'm a researcher at Africa Check, and I've been at Africa Check since 2020. As a researcher, I do the actual research behind a lot of our reports and guides and fact sheets and things like that. But I've also been involved in all sorts of other work that Africa Check does, like training other journalists and fact checkers and students and things like that.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Cosser. I'm also a researcher at Africa Check here in the South African office. I have been at Africa Check since 2022, so covered a few SONAs now. And yeah, it's lovely to be here on this fantastic podcast finally.
Thank you both for joining us. And just to get us started, as the year gets started, it's 2026 now, and we know that there'll be lots of heads of states and states that will be setting a direction and a course for the year for their nations. And I just want to get a sense, Africa Check has been fact-checking the SONA, and how long has that been going on? And what is the exact reason why you've decided to actually fact-check the SONA every year?
Well, Africa Check's been fact-checking the State of the Nation address since 2013, when it was Jacob Zuma giving his, at the time, 6th State of the Nation address. And that means we've been doing this almost as long as Africa Check has existed. And there's really good reasons to fact-check the SONA. It's a particularly impactful event as far as fact-checking goes for a number of different reasons. For one thing, it happens regularly every year, and it follows a predictable format, which means that it's a little bit easier to prepare, to cover it, to know what to expect. For another thing, it draws a lot of public attention. Like you said just now, the State of the Nation address is communicating the priorities and the vision of the state to the nation. And so that means a lot of people are watching it and want to know that it's accurate and factual, and that, the things that the state is communicating to the public have been vetted and verified. And finally, we also fact-check the State of the Nation address because the presidency puts a lot of effort into it. The presidency spends months preparing and hopefully making sure that they're getting all of their facts right. And if this is going to be like them putting their best foot forward, we want to make sure that we are holding them to the highest possible standard in the time when they should really be doing their best work.
Talking about putting their best foot forward, what actually happens in terms of logistics? What actually happens on SONA night for a fact-checking organization like Africa Check? In particular, when we're looking at what can be checked live versus what requires follow-ups after the speech.
So just to give you a little bit of context about what actually happened. On the night, basically, it's like the nerdiest party you've ever been to. We all get together online and hang out, and maybe there's some pizza involved, and we listen to a politician deliver the speech for a while and try and find, statistics in government documents and things. But how that actually works in terms of what we do in live fact-checking is really hard to do because fact-checking is inherently a time-consuming process. So depending on the claim, it can take a matter of minutes or hours or days to fact check thoroughly, right? So we need to really sort of triage, prioritize claims. and figure out what we can respond to sort of immediately and what we might need more time to respond to. So if we need to ask an expert about something, we will do that. And, sometimes we reach out to them before and say, hey, would you be willing to help if we need you to answer something, in the moment? And we basically write up and publish what we can immediately. And generally that's the more sort of straightforward claims. And then the more complicated ones we'll sort of add in later or publish separately once we've gone through the full thorough fact-checking process. And I think that's actually an important thing to emphasize, is that the same standards as always need to apply here, even when it's like quote unquote live fact checking. Just because we're trying to put things out quickly doesn't mean our sort of bar for evidence or research thoroughness changes at all. So it's essentially the same process as always.
And I'm pretty certain that Africa Check has been able to put together a repository or a set of claims that sort of resurface now and then in SONA speeches. Are there any claims or themes that you can share that have repeatedly shown up in speeches over the years?
So there's a few specific claims, but then there's also like types of claims. So something that's quite specific is around social grants. So I think there's been 2 or 3 SONAs now where there's been a sort of mix up between the number of recipients of social grants and the number of social grants. So because one person can get multiple grants, talking about the number of recipients when you actually mean the number of grants can mean that this number gets overstated. And so you're overstating the number of beneficiaries of the grants. So that's something that's come up a few times. But also things like using terms that might be intuitively understood by the public in one way, but actually mean a very specific different thing. So an example is work opportunities or housing opportunities. Kind of sounds like jobs or houses, but that's not really what it means. So a work opportunity might not be a permanent job. It may last a very short period, or a housing opportunity may not be an actual house. It may be more like a potential house, somewhere where there could be a house. So that's the kind of thing we see coming up a lot.
And in those nuances, and especially if we're looking at promises and long-term commitments that are made by the government, how do you approach fact-checking claims that make promises or long-term commitments?
Well, unfortunately, we can't fact-check the future because it's impossible to predict the future. And it might seem like it is possible to at least make very likely predictions about, what is almost certainly going to happen. But until we actually get to the time that the prediction is meant to come true and find out what happens, we're never going to know. If I make a prediction of what the country's GDP is going to be in 5 years based on like reams of economic data and information going back decades on how the market behaves and current trends and things like that, that might be a very good prediction and it might be very likely to come true. But I can't predict something like a freak pandemic that would totally upset the global economy. I can't predict something like an unusual year for rainfall that changes, what crop yields are like and influences the economy. So however accurate a prediction might be and however likely it is to come true, we can't actually say that it's true or false. And this means that when politicians promise to do something, then it's out of our hands as fact checkers to fact check those promises. Instead, what Africa Check has taken to doing is, while we are doing our live fact checking, we not only write down things like claims that we think are very important and interesting to check in the moment, but we take note of major promises and when they're due to be fulfilled. So if there's a promise made to, say, get a certain number of people onto antiretroviral medications within the next 5 years, we'll write down, what that figure is and when that date is going to come up, 5 years from now. And then every year we look back at those previous promises we've kept a record of, and we look at whether they have been kept. So, for example, just ahead of the 2024 SONA, we released a report on promises that had been made the previous year in 2023 and were due to come up in 2024, and we looked into which of those had been kept and which hadn't. And because it's unfair to be evaluating people based on information that they didn't necessarily know and couldn't predict, we try not to be totally dogmatic about, this promise was kept, but this promise was a lie or something like that. We try and in this process include as much context and information as possible about why these promises were or weren't kept, if they were kept, if they actually had the effect that they were aiming to have. So we try and include lots of additional detail to give some idea of, what the broader impacts of those promises were and what the complexities were that led to them maybe not being fulfilled.
Continue to follow the conversation online on all streaming platforms, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. When we're looking at, and you just mentioned now that it's very difficult to fact check the future, which poses a challenge. However, you do make an effort to record this and in a way track the promises when they do come to their term of fulfillment. However, circling back to what you said, you mentioned context, and also coming back to what Kirsten mentioned about certain contexts around housing and housing opportunities, how those can introduce different nuances that make it difficult to sort of interpret what is being communicated. When we're looking at areas that tend to be the most misleading or difficult to verify, especially when it relates to how missing context changes how audiences interpret SONA claims, which areas are these that you as Africa Check have experienced pose the most challenge?
So I think it's maybe here less about a specific topic area and more about a specific kind of information. You mentioned, missing context. I think from the perspective of the public interpreting this information, I think when numbers are technically correct, that's the most difficult thing to challenge. So when there's a sort of partial picture given, for example, when you focus in on one correct statistic that sort of suits your narrative and ignore the larger context or the longer time period. How we see this manifesting is things like using a sort of unusual baseline time period to compare to. So something that's come up is saying crime has decreased, but this is only true if you compare it to a year that had a particularly high crime rate. Or, life expectancy increased in this period since 2003 is one of the examples. And why 2003? Well, 2003 was sort of the peak of AIDS denialism and people dying from AIDS. So life expectancy was particularly low. So you're sort of cherry picking an unusual baseline, but the actual statistic you're using is technically correct. This can also be sort of zooming out too much, taking too long a view of something. So something like, this is how much the GDP growth rate has increased since 1994. And that, comparing something with how it was in 1994 might make sense intuitively, start of democracy, a whole new country. But when you look closer, is that really a fair baseline to compare progress to? Because that, for example, in the GDP growth rate example, that ignores that actually the growth rate has slowed a lot in recent years. So it's sort of, again, using technically correct numbers, but sort of framing them in a way that creates a particular narrative that is a little bit misleading. And I think this is particularly important because people trust numbers, right? I think that there's something about the sort of definitiveness and concreteness that makes it really easy to sort of mislead with correct statistics. It's the context around the number that's what really matters. So if it's a correct statistic that's being used in a misleading way, it's often hard to be the one coming in and saying, well, actually, this might seem like a very trivial or overly technical thing we're saying, but it changes everything about how you should interpret this number. So I think that's the most difficult in our sort of role as fact checkers.
And when we're looking at impact on behavior, in your experience, does fact-checking influence how politicians communicate or behave? It would be great if you could share an example or two.
So I'm sure this is something that has come up on this podcast before, but it is very difficult to assess the impact of fact-checking unless politicians actively acknowledge it. In fact, it can be pretty much impossible unless a politician says, oh, Africa Check, issued this report and it seems like I made a mistake and I said something that was incorrect and this is my retraction. Then it's very hard to know, even if they do change their behavior, whether that was because of our work or whether they would have made that change anyway. So that said, we do find ourselves wondering sometimes when politicians change the way that they speak or the way that they phrase things, or if they start getting something right that they used to get wrong. We do sort of look around among the research team and go, I wonder if that was our influence, if they are being a little bit more careful this time around because they know that we have held them to account over this in the past and they don't want us catching them out again. And that has happened with some of the topics that come up with SONA, with politicians, including Ramaphosa, sometimes using language a little bit more precisely after we have commented on things like examples that Kirsten raised earlier are really good ones. Distinctions between permanent jobs and work opportunities, for example, or distinctions between houses and housing opportunities. Look out this year for how the president speaks and whether he says things like the government has provided X many houses, or whether he uses a term that is maybe a bit more technical, like the government has provided X many housing opportunities, because being specific and clear is quite important. As Kirsten said, the way that those terms can be interpreted or misinterpreted can often be quite misleading. And we have called out politicians in the past for confusing those colloquial definitions or those colloquial terms like houses with the more formal terms that actually tell you something about what data is actually being talked about and how it was collected and what it refers to, like a term like housing opportunities. But like I say, it's impossible really to know whether a politician has been caught out by us and is making a change to how they speak, or if they would have corrected themselves anyway and they're just being more precise and a bit more specific. But where we do know we have made an impact is when politicians or other public figures cite Africa Check as a reliable source. So like the head of digital communications for the presidency has previously retweeted some verdicts that we have issued on claims by the president. And so we know that they are at least aware of Africa Check and aware of our fact checks. Other public figures, including government ministers, have acknowledged our work in one form or another over the years. Often this is not in a case where we have fact-checked them and they're correcting themselves. We would love it if more politicians and public figures acknowledged when they got something wrong and made a show of demonstrating responsible commitment to getting the facts right by correcting themselves publicly and retracting when they make mistakes. But we have been sort of more frequently acknowledged as a source of good information. So the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, and the South African Police Services have listed Africa Check as trusted sources for people looking to verify information. Opposition party leaders and things, or opposition politicians like Patricia de Lille have mentioned Africa Check in speeches and in public communications as sources of factual information. And when those things come up, we know that at least some people in politics are aware of our work, are reading our work, and trust us to be communicating accurate, factual, reliable information. So hopefully they are just as agreeable towards our work when we fact check them, and in the rare occasions, hopefully rare occasions, when they make mistakes and need to correct themselves.
I'm Kirsten Cosser.
I am Keegan Leech.
And you're listening to Behind the Facts.
You are listening to Behind the Facts.
I mean, you won't blow your own horn, but a raised awareness and an acknowledgement by departments like DERCO and SAPS, it is a show to show that the work that you're doing is not in vain. And it's also reassuring to know that there are organizations such as Africa Check and others across the continent that come together to make an effort to ensure that the information that is put out there in the public domain is accurate so that people can make informed decisions. However, for the listener who is listening here and is not a professional fact checker like the two of you and thinking to themselves, look, I don't even know the distinction between housing and housing opportunities. I'm not really good with stats, but I want to heed your caution about looking out for some things. What would be your advice, or what would you say is a tip for them to pay attention to when watching the next SONA?
Well, I'll jump in and respond to something quite specific that you said there. It's very common that people are going to be listening to the SONA or other political speeches or other news and saying, well, I don't know what these different technical terms mean. I'm not very good at stats. I'm not an expert in this. And one of the tips that we have is to stay informed before and after the SONA by seeing what experts think of claims. So we ourselves are not experts in everything, every topic that we fact check and comment on. And we know that not everyone can be an expert in everything, which is why it pays to be informed by seeking out people who are experts in a particular topic. So try and find out what housing experts, for example, are saying about what they expect to appear in the State of the Nation address, or see what housing experts say in response to the State of the Nation address, and whether they think that the facts about housing in South Africa were communicated accurately. And this is going to help you all year round if you are sort of staying in touch with what experts are saying and what people who sort of know their stuff and have really done the work to analyze things like statistics and break down jargon and so on. If you're staying abreast of that, then it's going to help you stay informed during the SONA, but it's also going to help you when the debates on the State of the Nation address come up, and it's going to help you following the news in general about the same topics. So that's one of the best tips that we have for you.
Yeah, and just to add on to that point about staying informed, if you sort of know generally what the picture of health or housing or education looks like in South Africa, then you can really use SONA as an opportunity to listen to what's being said, but also listen to what's being left out, because often the rest of the story or the other part of the picture is there in the absence of what is there, what is not said. But also comparing what has been done to earlier promises, right? We need the context of previous states of whatever thing we're looking at to be able to see what progress really looks like, what progress has been made. Apart from that, I mean, a sort of particular technical thing that anyone can do is also just listen out for that point about time periods or specific years. So if a particular year or time period is mentioned, ask yourself why that time period. If it seems like a sort of abstract period, why are you picking that year out of all the years to compare it to? Then maybe it's a sign that there might be some sort of cherry picking going on and you need to have a closer look at it.
Important from what you both have said is to stay informed, seek out expert insights, listen to what is being left out, compare claims from previous addresses, and be aware of time periods and cherry picking of claims. I would like to thank you both for taking the time to share your insights with us. It truly is an eye-opening conversation, and hopefully the audience and others who are in the field will take these insights and be able to implement them. Thank you, Keegan. Thank you, Kirsten. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And above all, remember that the truth does not defend itself. We do. I'm Thipe Maelane, and this has been Behind the Facts.